I was at the place where I needed to know. I mean, what I had given myself to, there was no turning back. There had to be a God of everything or a God of nothing. And if there was a God of nothing, it was all a big waste of time, I felt. And so having given myself to the possibility of that God of everything, I trusted it at all levels. You know, when I didn't have food, I fasted. There were times when I literally walked out into the world, as you have read in the book, when I didn't know where I would end up or where I would go. And, you know, miraculously, I've never spent a single night on the street. There was always something that came through. So how did I do it? I just trusted the God of everything. And as I said, there was no turning back once I had made that leap. Again, it's one of those things where you can say, well, you had the choice to turn back, but you really don't. There are things we jump into that we give ourselves to out of inspiration, not out of fear, but out of inspiration. And it's like the inspiration itself demands that we hold the ground. And I don't think any of us are capable of, like, to figure out, like, how will I live? How will I get food and shelter? I think, you know, we can't necessarily worry about that stuff once it's there. It will either come or it won't. And that's the stuff that came when it was necessary. And when it didn't, you know, because I think we all have ideas about what we think we need or about the way it should come, and it almost never does. But when it didn't come the way I thought, there were these amazing lessons and energetic experiences that came out of trusting the fact that I'm hungry at this moment, or I don't know where I'm going now. There were these moments that would fall into place that often had to do with other people or other things going on, that would give it a kind of deeper meaning, and that's the stuff that I fed on. That's the stuff that kept me going and kept me inspired and kept me alive. Because as long as we're happy and inspired, you know, it doesn't matter what we have or don't have. I think there's a totality to the human experience where we are a body as well, and if there's a God of everything, then that body will be taken care of, and it has been. And it certainly has been terrifying at times, but there was always something that came through. And also, when I finally fully gave myself to the experience, all of that seems to have fallen into place in a very graceful way. I think a big part of the terror of trusting at that level was fully accepting that what I need would come to me. And it took a long time for me to give myself so fully to that. I mean, in a way, I gave myself to it by leaping in, but still I was resisting. And the moment, you know, I really completely said, this is my life, is when it all ended. And I've had support coming in many ways since that time. But it was so much about the lessons and so little about the material idea of what we think we need.
You think, like, one thing you said is that almost taking action is almost easier sometimes than internally. Like you mentioned, going from a state of resistance to acceptance, even though you were still acting upon it. I mean, what sort of advice would you give for somebody if they're willing to take the action, but internally they still have this resistance? Or you mentioned at times it was a bit terrifying. I mean, how would you suggest going from a state of resistance or maybe a little fear to a state of acceptance and trust? I mean, I think that was one of the most beautiful aspects of your story, is just progression of trusting and faith.
I mean, we all need to be where we are. I mean, I have many people who come here. You know, that has become my life for the most part, is working with people who are in that place. And I think, you know, the bottom line is we have to accept the fact that we are all in the best seat in the house. There's nothing wrong with our lives. We haven't done anything to make them so wrong. And the next step that is inspired will completely give us all that we need. And how we do it, I think we can only do our very best. And it's a very humble process. You know, I think if you think about it, it's more our arrogance and our idea of who we think we are and what we think we should have that stands in the way of that level of trust. I think it's constant attention to humility and also an asking. We're out there all hustling to get what we want in this world. How often do we really let go and ask? And then be attentive to the response to that asking. Because I think if we're watching in a very subtle way, we'll see that we get what we ask for very often. but we're not doing a lot of asking. We're operating out of fear. We're operating out of insecurity. We're operating out of social ideas of what we were taught by our parents in our schools, that we should go out and get a job and feed ourselves and do all the things that we're supposed to do and get rich and live happily ever after. But how many of us are overriding that voice and even having that conversation with the mystery and then responding to it? Because in that is the most direct relationship with inspiration that we can cultivate and develop. And most of us can play in that area. And I think that's what the studio was for me. As intense and driven artist as I was, it still didn't require the courage that it required to let it all go and trust all of my life to that inspiration.
Another aspect of your journey that I found to be really interesting and inspiring is it wasn't just all internally based. You ran across and met some really interesting people along the way, and some of the people I know they would have tested my ability to trust, because it seemed like there were some people maybe living on the fringes of society and potential muggers or a mob boss maybe even, and you were able to sort of connect with their humanity. And I was kind of curious, what was that like? How were you able to see the humanity in them and just sort of also just trust that they wouldn't try to harm you necessarily?
Yeah, well, I wasn't trusting in them as much as I was trusting in the perfection of each moment. I mean, situations when I ended up in that were potentially violent, you could see that this is dangerous, and you'd be a fool to think otherwise. And of course, I was very frightened by certain experiences. I almost always was. But the fact is, underneath it all, that's where the conversation would begin. You know, it would be like, okay, God, I don't know what this moment's about. I couldn't see the good in those people. But it was only in giving myself completely to the moment, by turning around and walking back into it and following that small, minuscule prompting to trust this moment, that I would find the answer. It's like jumping into the ocean. If you don't know how to swim, you're not going to learn until you're in the water. So I can't say I went into it seeing the beauty of people. I went into it not knowing. There's something about the ability to hold unknowing. It's also a very alchemical position where unknowing is written into the event of transformation. It's one of the moments where you can't know what's going on. You can't know what you're doing. And it's often the most powerful moments when we can hold that unknowing, that answers come. And I think all of us would love to have all the answers before we get into a situation. But I think when you're living really one-on-one with the mystery, you have to trust that you don't know until you need to know. And similarly, I'm doing a lot of public speaking these days. I have an event coming up with CEOs of several major corporations. And I know when I do those things, and I've done many of them, I don't even know what I'm going to say until I'm up there and I look out and I feel what's going on in the room. And then I know. And if I prepare, it totally doesn't work. I can't know in advance. And I think the power that's available can only be accessed by making yourself vulnerable enough and hold that unknowing long enough to receive it. And it's terror for most of us. It's still scary for me, but I know it works.
Yeah, and I love that about, I think it's really cool how you say it still is terror for you, but somehow you make that choice to go from a place of terror to a place of inspiration and trusting and faith, and you think that comes down to asking. No matter what your circumstances, I think everybody's going to be faced with moments of fear and doubt, and then you think it's important to overcome those moments by just asking, saying, like, help me move from a state of fear to a state of inspiration. What do you do? I know you kind of touched upon this earlier, but I think it's great. What do you do to move from a state of terror that you mentioned to a state of trust and faith?
I just give myself to it. And with helping people, I know I have people come to me who are in great pain. I just got back from New York and was with people who were suffering. And I know right in the heat of battle, here these people are, pouring out their sorrow, pouring out their pain and the intensity about their confusion and fear. And in the face of that, I literally ask, how can I help? I mean, I literally just go within myself and say, I don't know. How can I help? While I'm looking at them, while I'm listening, it's almost like I disconnect. It's just about being in the moment and maintaining that dialogue with the source, with your source, whatever it is. And you can call it whatever you want to. You can call it God. You can call it your inner self or the greater knowing, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you are open to that dialogue and that you make yourself vulnerable enough to receive.